Well, hello, my friends. Welcome back. I'm Mini Pride from Milk and Cookies Total War, and today we're going to be delving into the newly unveiled roster of the Vampire Coast, the new units, the new models, and how they will play on the battlefields of Total War Warhammer 2. This is a gunpowder faction through and through. Overwhelming range firepower, cannons, cannon monsters, monstrously sized cannons, and a whole lot of dead things wielding blunderbuss, hand cannons, handguns, and pistols. And your job is to use that chaff, the meat shields, the zombos, and the tar pits to just stall an opponent for as long as physically possible while you absolutely eviscerate them from long range. And once they finally close the gap, that is when the real butcher's work begins, because they've got a big assortment of monsters, monstrous infantry, and vampires to provide that punching power in a melee grind. But as an undead faction without traditional cavalry, you're gonna have a severe lack of mobility. No Blood Knights or Black Knights to put pressure on an enemy flank. You just have to kind of deal with that slow speed you have across the board with shambling zombies and hulking colossi forged from flesh and rotten wood. So to reflect their overt reliance on DACA, and there's never enough DACA, their main faction trait is called Extra Powder, which means their artillery and gunpowder units will do substantially more damage in their opening salvos. As they start running out of all that extra powder they have lying around, their shots will go back to normal, their normal baseline damage output, but the opposing army will also be getting closer, which means their guns will probably be more accurate simply based on proximity. So basically, it translates to severe damage to enemies from range. Anytime they try to rush you, you're going to be shredding them on the way in, and they have a heavy focus on gunpowder than even the Empire or the Dwarfs. A very heavy focus that should be very satisfying to pull off with salvos of cannon fire on gunpowder going the way of the enemy. But gun lines can be buffed by a new hero type called a Gunnery Wight, which will help to further increase their already substantial range capabilities and help restore ammo as well. So if you plop him down to something next to something like a cannon or handguns, they should be getting more of their ammunition, although we don't know exactly how that's going to work quite yet. So for the legendary lords, they've obviously already been revealed, but this is the best look at we've gotten so far at how they'll actually play in game. And as Luthor Harkon is the faction leader, we're going to start with him first. He was given the blood kiss by Aberrash himself in Ancient Lamia, which means he is one of the eldest and one of the strongest vampires in existence when it comes to melee combat. That's what blood dragons are all about. But he combines that with a sidearm pistol that he can fire while on the move, which is pretty powerful, but he has absolutely no spellcasting whatsoever, because his connection to the Winds of Magic was severed. But he has high resistance to magical damage output to compensate, and in a roster with limited mobility, his Deathstreak Terrorgeist will be one of the few options the Vampire Coast actually have for taking to the air, and you will likely be able to pull off some Goon Squad shenanigans with them and one or two other Terrorgeists, which will make for a pretty potent air force. We know Terrorgeists are already one of the most utilized units in the Vampire Counts roster, transferring them over to Vampire Coast, where they have even less flyers, but you goon them up together, they can be very scary, and in a faction with that much gunpowder, having aerial superiority might not be such a bad thing. But if you want to bring 3 of them, including the mount with Harkin, that's incredibly expensive, so if you want to contest the air, might just want to stick with Harkin and 1 more Terrorgeist, because if you add 2 more on top of it, it's going to be like half your army, which is very, very expensive. There's no question, though, the lack of spellcasting is going to hurt him, because one of the best things about Vampire Lords is their versatility. On big, scary mounts like a Terrorgeist, they can fight in melee with the best of them, but they can also do stuff like summon undead and heal and all the rest. But Harkin, you'll need to invest in a hero-level spellcaster if you want magic, so he won't have quite that same level of versatility. Hopefully that means his melee damage and his utility and his extra sidearm pistol will be enough to make up for that and make him a worthy choice on the Vampire Coast roster. But if we're talking about the legendary lord I am most excited for, it is definitely Count Nautilus. From his aesthetic, to his lore, to his gameplay style, I think he's going to end up being my personal favorite, and I think he'll end up being the favorite for a lot of other people as well, because he has pretty much everything. He's a hybrid caster of the lore of vampires and lore of shadows, which are already 2 of the best lores of magic in the game. He's super tanky, has regeneration, and on foot comes equipped with a huge halberd for wrecking armored and large targets. But when he's on a Necrofex Colossus mount that can fire cannonballs, like 4 of them, all at the same time across the map, I don't imagine we'll be seeing him on foot all that often. That mount is just way too cool, and sounds like it'll be way too good to pass up, and I think he's just going to be a great choice overall. On paper, definitely seems like the strongest lord to me, but that will probably end up being contested by one of the other lord choices as well, which we'll talk about in a little bit. But coming in at number 3, we got Aranessa Saltspite, Queen of the Tides, as the 3rd legendary lord with a Rotting Promethean Crab mount, a bonus for large halberd, high melee defense but low armor, a net ability, which is a huge deal. We know how good snares are and nets are in multiplayer in general, and good physical resistance similar to the dodge chance we see on Clan Eshin units. Sounds like she'll end up being more of a cost-efficient pick when compared to something like a caster melee hybrid like Noctilus, who we might imagine is going to be very expensive, but just looking at her toolkit on paper, she's relatively tanky, especially on that crowd. She has that armor-piercing bonus for large, and she's going to have the mass on that Rotting Promethean as well. So I don't know how often we'll see her on foot, although I imagine she might have some very cool animations with those sawfish legs, but I'm very excited to see what she can do on her crab, because you think about a high mass armor-piercing thing like that, probably going to be pretty solid mount, even if it doesn't have the most mobility. So we might get to see her played a lot. And finally, Madame Cylostra Direfin is a spectral, ethereal figure who sounds like she will be the only legendary lord with access to the lore of the deep. We still don't know exactly what that lore will entail yet. I'll try to get information on that for you guys as soon as I possibly can, but as the only ethereal lord in the trilogy thus far, she has no armor, mediocre melee defense, and spirit leeches are going to be the absolute bane of her existence. They will literally delete her from the game. Like, 2 of them will probably put her near the edge of crumbling. 3 will probably just outright kill her. But with that said, she does have a Rotting Leviathan crab mount, an even bigger, meaner version than the one Aranessa has. That's a Rotting Promethean. This one is a Rotting Leviathan, the even bigger crab, and as lords usually take the profile of their mounts, whatever they're riding, that means she's going to get a ton more armor, a ton more survivability, a ton more HP, and killing power in melee. But you're going to have to pay for that. Casters on big tanky mounts are always expensive as hell. They're usually the most expensive units in the entire game. And of course, you can also summon undead Bretonnian knights in ethereal form to help protect her or get rear charges into an enemy battle line. So she's got a ton of tools at her disposal. At the same time, though, you're going to be paying for all the utility she brings to the table as well. In campaign, CA have already said you can upgrade that ability, that summon ability, to go from Knights Errant to Knights of the Realm, or Questing Knights, which is crazy good. I mean, think about what ethereal Questing Knights can do in melee. That is no joke, unless you Buna them into oblivion. But if you do that, you're wasting, what, like a 19 Winds of Magic spell, whatever it is, on a summon that costs nothing to bring to the table. So probably not going to be worth it for you. So those are the lords, and they've got a lot going for them, but of course there will be some generic lords as well, and they come in the form of vampire fleet admirals. The male version has access to the lore of vampires, death, or deeps, and specializes in combating large targets, while the female version has the same spell loadouts but a pistol instead of whatever gives him the bonus for large, and that pistol will likely be somewhat similar to Harkin's, although you might imagine Harkin's will do more damage. They've also got a hero version called a Captain, and a Gunnery Wight, like I already said, who will support range units in a similar manner to the Master Engineer of the Dwarfs, except he literally replaces Ammo 2, which will obviously synergize exceptionally well with their heavy focus on missile play. But the Morngul Haunter is the hero that I'm most excited to see in action, because it sounds and looks absolutely terrifying. Vanguard deployment, stock, anti-infantry, which is awesome. We haven't seen very many lords or heroes specialize in taking on foot troops with an actual bonus for infantry that will of course increase their hit chance and their weapon damage against them. And then it also has regeneration and mass that will allow it to push through and maybe go after something like a dismounted caster and stuff like that in the back line. So these Wendigo bad boys are going to be scary when you see them coming after you. They might not be particularly tanky. I mean, they're not wearing any armor, and they're not ethereal. That's already been confirmed. So it'll be interesting to see if it can find a niche on the battlefield. But from the screenshot, it looks gigantic, it looks terrifying, and it definitely seems to fulfill its own unique role, which I think is great. Which then brings us to the core infantry, the backbone of the Vampire Coast armies. As we suspected, given how most undead factions play, tons of chaff, tons of meat shield troops whose only job it is to go in and die and give your big boys more time to fire and shred stuff from long range. Tons of zombie pirates from the deckhands who will apparently sit between skeleton warriors and empire swordsmen on the power curve, so significantly better than regular zombies. to the gunnery mob with fire on the move pistols, and 3 separate range variants with armor-piercing rifles, to short-range shotguns with significant knockback, to bombers who will actually play more like miners with blasting charges, running up close to melee range, throwing in their grenades into the middle of enemy formations. And then we get to the elite. Now, the Vampire Coast is not known for elite infantry, but the Depth Guard might change that perception just a little bit. They look badass with 2 variants, one dual weapons variant, kind of like Berserker style, and the other with halberds, and they are literal vampire infantry. So even though their model count is small, you can expect them to pack a pretty serious punch in melee. Not sure yet how viable it will be to field them as your main line in multiplayer, or if it will even be viable at all. I know in some of the screenshots we've seen them at a unit count of 16, kind of like aspiring champions. Not sure if C will go that route or another one, but it's looking like they're going to be one of those units that at least hits very hard and has good melee stats. Now, whether that will make them one of those elite infantry go-to, we're not sure. But once you get to a point where you can afford them in your campaign, if they're not like aspiring champions, there's a good chance they'll take over the deckhand's role and that they will kind of be your frontline troops. But you'll have to be pretty rich, I would imagine, to be able to field them because they're vampire infantry, which means in some ways they're going to be a little bit like dismounted blood knights, right? They're going to be literal units of vampires, which there are very few examples of in the trilogy thus far. Sirens are not going to be heroes. People keep asking me why I call them sirens. Well, that's because that's what they're called. It's just a play off the word siren, but it's spelled with a Y and 2 E's, which is why I say siren, and kind of a more elite version of the spirit host we never actually got to see for the vampire counts. They are ethereal units with good mobility, fantastic physical resistance as you expect from an ethereal unit, magical attacks, AP damage, and a charmed effect that lowers melee attack for anyone they're engaged with. So quite similar to Karen Race in that respect, they will get absolutely dumpstered by magical attacks or by direct damage spells. So, as we've said, the ranged DPS is obviously going to be what sets the Vampire Coast apart from the rest of the roster. And they have a plethora of options for shredding stuff from long range. The Carronade is comparable to the Empire and Dwarf cannons, but might even be given grapefruit shot, or grape shot, not grapefruit shot, just regular grape shot, as a secondary ability for mowing down infantry, which would be really cool. I'd love to see that in action. There are a few things more satisfying than a close-range volley of grape shot to an enemy's face, and the deck droppers seem like they're going to be absolutely hilarious. They are Fellbats carrying zombie gunners and bombers into battle who can either shoot armor-piercing missiles from long range or drop bombs on groups of tightly packed infantry. The deck droppers, in particular, sound like they could be a problem for factions that don't have a good range presence. The power of handguns, mixed with the mobility of flyers, means they could kind of just sit on top of your backline or cavalry with impunity if you don't bring the right kind of build. And that will hurt very, very bad, so definitely a unit to keep an eye on, but it's always possible their missile damage will be significantly less than a full unit of handgunners, so it's just going to end up how CA decides to balance it. We have no idea how it's going to work on that front quite yet. But the deck gunners are our first look at what ogre lead belchers might end up being like in Total War Warhammer 3. So these are zombies that carry literal hand cannons. They have very limited mobility according to the blog, but powerful range DPS that breaks shields on contact, has a shield breaker trait, has armor piercing, and will pass through multiple entities per shot. So get a couple of those bad boys focusing a single target. I imagine they're going to drop pretty quick, especially in combination with Carronade artillery. So again, as we kind of move through this roster here, you're going to keep noticing they have this overwhelming range DPS that will make pretty much any faction in the game, maybe even the dwarfs, come to them. And the Bloated Corpse is one of the most unique units we've seen in the trilogy thus far. It's a swollen, drowned, zombified husk filled with noxious gas and bile that will sprint towards an enemy, kind of Helm's Deep style, Berserker style, and just suicide itself in the middle of enemy formations. It is a single entity, and on stream they said it can literally kill an entire infantry unit when it launches itself into an enemy, but they deal friendly fire damage, so they could also kill an entire one of yours, and can be killed by range units easily as well. So you have to be very careful with them, because it sounds like a unit that will come down to kind of availability in campaign, right? If you're literally going to suicide the unit, they can't be too expensive, or you just wouldn't ever pick them because you literally lose the unit in every single battle you actually use it in. So yeah, pricing and availability are probably going to be the two things that matter the most, and CA will have to work on making sure that balance is right. It is easily countered, obviously, by range units, but if their price is right and you have early and easy access to them, they could be worth it. I mean, it's going to be incredibly satisfying to watch them do their stuff. Seeing them just like blow up an entire infantry formation is going to be great, but it's one of those things where they could be absolutely terrible and literally never worth using. So really, it just depends on their stats, how tanky they are, how not tanky they are, or how much they cost. Now, the monster roster for the Vampire Coast is super interesting because they've got stuff that will perform a bunch of different roles. A few are purely based on range DPS, some are more tanky, some are meant to rush headlong in and kind of just absorb fire, and others are meant as stealthy flankers that can chew through infantry with a surprise rear charge. We've got our first look at ogres with the animated hulks, which are horrifically mutated pirate boys from the Mountains of Morn, who now have squids and octopus for heads, and cannons and anchors for arms. They're severely mutated, grotesque looking, but look amazing. But they're essentially Chaos Spawn, Frankenstein abominations available early in the campaign that will fight alongside the zombies and the chaff and provide some much needed infantry killing power and survivability. We already mentioned the hero variant, but the half-starved Wendigo Spectres are called Mournguls, with Vanguard in stock, decent move speed, although it sounds like they might end up being a little bit slower than cavalry, armor piercing, anti-infantry, and regeneration in melee due to the hunger. I imagine they're going to be pretty squishy. Sounds like they aren't ethereal and probably won't have much armor, but their description in the Monstrous Arcanum talks about a chilling miasma that surrounds them, and we've seen similar effects with the Norscan units, so they might have like a contact slow, frostbite, or something similar to prevent infantry from easily disengaging. One of the issues we've had with Vanguard and stock units in the previous iterations of the trilogy, though, is that they typically pay an exorbitant price for having those traits, so we'll see if that trend changes a bit once we get our hands on them. But on paper, they sound a little bit niche, but certainly a fun little anchor to your line on the flank or something to maybe get a couple rear charges off could be a blast. But the highlight, of course, are the crabs. Crab people. Crab people. Taste like crab, talk like people. Smell like crab, kiss like people. They're the kind of unit whose data plan you would not want to shun, you insolent human. But the Rotting Prometheans are gonna be tanky as balls, with high mass, high armor, and charge defense against large, so one of those perfect backline units that you can use to prevent enemy cav from charging in. You can kind of punish big flyers from landing in the middle of your army, and use that mass to surround them, and basically just prevent them from going anywhere, and that would then give your gunners the time they need to just kind of rip you apart and shoot you up. But in keeping with the theme of the faction, they have limited mobility according to the blog, so you're not going to have any true fast movers outside the scurvy dogs and fell bats, who don't appear to be getting much in the way of a reskin, which is disappointing. We've seen some of their artwork in the screenshots so far, and they seem like they look exactly like direwolves and fell bats from vampire accounts, which is, again, a little bit disappointing. But the Promethean monstrous cav also appear to have a gunnery mob variant with hand cannons to disrupt nearby infantry as well. So a bit of extra utility and range DPS on that variant. The big Momma Crab is, of course, the Rotting Leviathan with almost steam tank level armor, a line breaker meant to tear through elite infantry and tar pit while your cannons go to work, and it looks great. But I gotta say, I was really hoping to see another top tier unique monster unit, and it might have been too much to ask for. I don't know. I certainly think it would have been very cool to see another one. I might have already mentioned it on stream, but I really do think CA missed an opportunity here to include a rotting, belching whale as another DLC headliner. Honestly, I don't really think of a crab as a leviathan. That's usually the word used to describe something like a gigantic predatory whale like Moby Dick or the macroraptorial sperm whales from our own prehistoric era. But seeing a gigantic Miocene-style whale with vicious teeth getting wheeled around on a huge contraption with zombies pouring buckets of water on it as it rots and dries out, and the necromancy binding it, keeping it on the very edge of undeath as it belches acid and chews up anything that gets close and kind of flaps its tail and just bludgeons people with the rear end. I think that would be like the quintessential Vampire Coast monster to me, and it's kind of what I was picturing when I first saw the zombie pirate roster on in the White Dwarf magazine. I think that would have been a super cool addition. Very grimdark, and kind of represent the horrific depths that they're willing to sink to control Unlife and control these huge monsters. And yeah, I think it was kind of a huge missed opportunity that I would have loved to see CA kind of pursue, but obviously I had no control over that, and it was the first thing I thought of when I thought of White Dwarf and all that stuff. Rotting Leviathan, like don't get me wrong, the huge crab is so cool looking, the model on it is amazing, it's a great addition. I would just like to see one more thing on top of it, and I kind of wish I had been in the boardroom when they were drawing these guys up for the first time. But with that said, they do have the Necrofex Colossus, which is an absolute beauty of a behemoth. It can move while firing 4 cannonballs at once, has a super tall frame, so almost always has line of sight on attackers. It can summon zombie deckhands with an ability called Abandoned Ship, and functions in a similar battlefield role to a Cygor. Solid in melee, terror-causing, but a lot of its DPS will come from the time before the two lines clash. It's a super awesome addition, the model's amazing, and it is from the Monstrous Arcanum. Super glad to see it make it into the game. And to round out the monsters, the Deathshriek Terrorgeist. Don't know if it is actually going to be the exact same stats as the Vampire Counts version, but the blog said that it's going to fill out mostly the same battlefield role, so a flyer that can goon alongside Luthor Harkon. That might be its best role as well. A really solid unit with a powerful Screech attack that's good for killing cav models, good for hunting monsters and single entities, and providing some aerial power to a faction, mostly lacking in that capacity. That's all assuming, of course, that it's going to function exactly like the Terrorgeist does for the Vampire Counts, but who knows if they'll end up giving it a slightly different role as well. And finally, the Queen Bess, a one-time Regiment of Renown that can be only acquired through a right, possibly the largest model in the game, maybe bigger than a mammoth, that fires in a huge arc more akin to a mortar that will obliterate enemy troops on impact and severely slow those lucky enough to survive the blast. Long range and arcing trajectory might mean you can dodge it though, because you can certainly dodge mortars, so you might need like a gunnery wight or something like that to buff it up and make sure that those expensive misses don't go to waste and give it some more ammo back. The unique unit for Aranessa Saltspite and the Pirates of Sartosa are the Free Company. I think most people are in agreement right now that this unit looks kind of terrible. Like they were thrown together at the very last minute by an inexperienced modder. They just stick out like a sore thumb, honestly, compared to the rest of the roster. It looks like they just are not finished yet. The rest of the roster looks so good. But yeah, I really think CA need to go back on this one and change their visuals around. It's just kind of funny because the current Empire Free Company look and play more like pirates than literal pirate units from the pirate capital of the world. These guys will function as an early armor-piercing damage kind of unit with boarding axes, but the way they hold it, the way they attack with them, it seems like it's going to be janky. It looks like they're holding it like the Great Sword, so they might have the Great Sword animations, which is going to look really weird with an axe. But they really do and play less like pirates than the non-pirate units we already have in game in the Empire Free Company. So at the very least, I think CA should just copy pasta them over and maybe give them like 360-degree fire arc, maybe lower speed to compensate for that. And if they want to keep the exact same role with that armor-piercing damage they've already thought up, then have like a sidearm that they can fire from range, but once they get into melee, they take out their boarding axes and then fill that armor-piercing role. I just think they need a little bit more love than what they've got currently. And obviously, some people were expecting that like Jago Roth or Aranessa Saltspite would have an entire pirate roster of humans. I mean, I think that was a little bit overzealous of people to expect that. But, I mean, if you're going to include a pirate unit, make them look like pirates, make them play like pirates. Right now, they don't. So yeah, the Scurvy Dogs and Fell Bats are a bit boring, obviously. Makes sense to port them over, but wouldn't have minded seeing them get a bit more of a facelift or a slightly different role than what they have on the Vampire Counts roster. But overall, I'm pretty happy with the Vampire Counts, or rather the Vampire Coast roster. I think it looks really good. It's got a very distinct playstyle focusing on overwhelming range firepower, some really gorgeous and terrifying models, clear strengths and weaknesses, in which I think mobility might be a big problem for them. At least what we've seen so far, it doesn't seem like they have very many fast movers at all. Certainly nothing that can compete with something like Blood Knights or Black Knights, that kind of thing. But they've got the tanky monsters and the high mass units that can help them turtle up and counteract that, alongside mountains of meat shielding to throw into the meat grinder. One thing I am very curious about is if there will be a Merworm model that appears anywhere in game that maybe modders will be able to use and turn into a playable unit. It sounds like CA won't be adding it as a playable unit just yet, or if they ever will. which, I mean, it doesn't really surprise me. It's actually available to the High Elves, I believe, in the Monstrous Arcanum. But honestly, it's hard to know if we're ever going to get our hands on them in campaign, or if we get to see a Merworm in the finale of the campaign either. They've obviously been hinting a lot at it. It's going to be a campaign mechanic for now, but they might be holding on to something that, like, reveal later. I have absolutely no idea on that topic. But it'd be pretty cool, obviously, to get to see him in the finale or in some kind of cameo in the campaign itself. In the flesh, obviously, not just through events and whatever campaign stuff they've already hinted at. But, like, a boss fight, something like that would be really cool. We shall see. Overall, I think this is a really cool way to bring the Vampire Coast to life, even though we'd always love to see more and more unique models and assets. There is obviously some overlap here that CA is taking to full advantage of, and making sure that, like, whatever can be used from Vampire accounts over to Vampire Coast can be utilized, which makes sense. But, I mean, there's a lot of unique stuff here that looks really cool, and besides a few missteps here or there, I think that they're going to be a lot of fun. Now, in terms of campaign mechanics, there's very little we know right now. I will cover those when I can. I imagine there will be a campaign playthrough uploaded by CA relatively soonish. I mean, we don't have that much more time before the DLC goes live. But yeah, the next step is to see what the deal is with the Lore of Deep, see some campaign gameplay, and then hopefully be able to show off my own very, very soon when I get my hands on it. So, hope you all have enjoyed this look at the Vampire Coast roster. Let me know what you think, what you like, what you think should be changed, what you don't like, and I will see you all in the next video. Pride, signing out for now. Have a good one, guys.